What if I told you that one of the most devastating psychological weapons unleashed in the 20th century wasn't a weapon of steel or firepower? It wasn't a tank, a bomb, or even a propaganda poster. It was a document, a sociological report, so explosive, so corrosive to the very foundation of a totalitarian state, that the most ruthless political machine in modern history, the Nazi SS, did everything it could to bury it. They classified it, locked it away, and prayed that it would vanish forever. This isn't speculation. This isn't some late-night conspiracy theory. This is history, a fact that forces us to look into the darkest corners of human behavior. And if you listen carefully, you'll realize this isn't just about the 1940s. It's about why so many men today feel lost, betrayed, and disillusioned. Because this story is not about guns or uniforms. It's about human nature, female nature, male obligation, and the fragile thread that ties loyalty to survival. Before we dive into the shadows of this forgotten study, let me say this. If you're the kind of person who doesn't want comforting lies but wants the truth, the brutal, unvarnished truth, then I wrote something for you. My book, The Black Book of Human Nature, is a practical manual, not theory. It reveals the suppressed patterns of behavior that most people refuse to acknowledge, and it will give you tools to finally see through the illusions you've been fed. The link is in the pinned comment. But now, let's go back to the beginning. Our story does not start with battlefields or rubble. It starts in the mind of one man, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the architect of the Nazi machine. Himmler wasn't just a fanatic, he was a bureaucrat of madness. A man who believed you could build an empire not only with guns but with breeding charts, social experiments, and meticulous records. To him, the Reich wasn't just a state, it was a biological project. And in that project, men and women had defined roles. For the men, duty was clear. They were to march, fight, bleed, and die for the fatherland. They were warriors, disposable and replaceable. But the women were meant to be the stable center, the hearth, the loyal wives and mothers who would preserve the race and nurture the next generation. They were depicted as unshakable, as eternal, as pure. In posters, in speeches, in films, the German woman was celebrated as the quiet strength behind the soldier. But Himmler, paranoid, calculating, obsessed with control, was not content with propaganda. He wanted proof. He wanted to know if the myth was real. And so, in the early 1940s, he commissioned a secret investigation, not for public eyes, not for newspapers. This was an internal SS matter, classified at the highest levels. The man assigned to this dangerous task was SS Oberführer Dr. Wilhelm Spengler, a sociologist working with the Sicherheitsdienst, the Nazi intelligence service. His orders were simple: find out whether German women were truly loyal to their men at the front. Were they waiting faithfully, or were the cracks already forming in the Nazi ideal of the perfect family? Spengler was given unprecedented access. He could study censorship reports from soldiers' letters, interrogate men returning on leave, question field police, even sift through secret party communications. His mission was to strip away the illusion and deliver the naked truth. And what he uncovered was a nightmare for the SS. Imagine this: you are 19 years old, your name is Karl, you're freezing in a foxhole outside Stalingrad. The mud clings to your boots, artillery shakes the ground, and every day is a battle to stay alive. The only thing that keeps you tethered to sanity are the letters from home. The words of Anna, the girl you promised to marry. You carry her photograph like a relic. You tell yourself you're fighting for her smile, for the life you'll build together after the war. Then mail call comes, but there is no letter from Anna. Instead, you receive one from your mother. Her words stumble, hesitating. She tells you Anna has been seen walking with a French prisoner of war, one of the men assigned to forced labor in the town. Then, almost as an afterthought, your mother writes that Anna has now moved in with a party official, a man twice her age, a man who will never see the battlefield. At the end, she adds, "I'm so sorry, my son, be strong." In that moment, something inside you breaks. The cold around you isn't just the Russian winter, it's the cold realization that everything you thought you were fighting for is gone. Your fatherland, your loyalty, your sacrifice, Suddenly it all feels like a cruel joke. According to Spengler's report, this wasn't rare. It was widespread, an epidemic. His team's findings revealed that infidelity among soldiers, wives, and sweethearts was not just occurring, it was rampant. In major cities, Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, the numbers were staggering. Spengler estimated that more than half of women with partners at the front were engaged in affairs. But the most disturbing part wasn't the number, it was the pattern. The betrayals weren't random. They followed a logic, a chillingly consistent logic. Women were overwhelmingly unfaithful with two categories of men, those with status and those with resources. High-ranking party officials, factory managers, industrialists, men shielded from the front by their importance to the Reich, became magnets for women seeking protection. At the same time, foreign prisoners and laborers, especially the French, became objects of transactional relationships. Coffee, chocolate, scarce goods that could soften the hardships of wartime. The loyalty wasn't to the man, it wasn't to the nation, it was to survival, to advantage, to what Spengler called the primal calculus. One case buried in the files became infamous within the SS. A woman, let's call her Frau Schmidt, lost contact with her husband, a sergeant in the Afrika Korps, missing in action. Within weeks, she became the mistress of a local party official. When the Red Cross asked her to confirm the search for her husband, she coldly replied it was unnecessary, that it was a waste of resources. When neighbors whispered, she shrugged and said, "A living dog is better than a dead lion." For Himmler and the SS, this was nothing less than catastrophic. The entire edifice of Nazi propaganda, that German women were the rock, the eternal loyal partners of German men, was shattered. What they found instead was opportunism, pragmatism, and a brutal logic of survival. And so the report was buried, classified, locked away in SS archives, never spoken of publicly, because if the men in the trenches learned the truth, that their sacrifices were being repaid not with loyalty but with betrayal, the fighting spirit of the Wehrmacht would collapse overnight. This is more than just a forgotten piece of history. This is a warning, because what Spengler uncovered wasn't just about German women in the 1940s. It was about human nature, stripped bare under the pressure of survival. It was about the illusions men build, the obligations they shoulder, and the brutal truth that not every story of loyalty survives contact with reality. What the Nazis buried was not just a document. It was a weapon, a psychological time bomb that threatened to unravel the entire foundation of their war effort. You see, the Spengler report did not simply point to individual betrayals. It revealed a structural betrayal, a pattern so consistent that it struck at the very heart of the German war machine. The propaganda posters of radiant mothers and loyal sweethearts. Lies. What Spengler uncovered was hypergamy in its rawest, most brutal form. The report documented something macabre. Divorce rates in Germany surged during the war, initiated predominantly by women whose husbands were still fighting, freezing, and dying at the front. These women were not waiting to become widows. They were preemptively cutting ties, severing bonds with men they now viewed as liabilities. They were divorcing soldiers who were not yet corpses, but whom they had already condemned as ghosts. In the cold arithmetic of survival, a husband at Stalingrad was a dead man walking, and a party official in Berlin was security, status, and safety. The Spengler report was a bomb, cold, empirical, data-driven proof that the idealized image of female loyalty, the very bedrock of Nazi morale, was a fiction. For a state obsessed with control, obsessed with image, obsessed with myth, the implications were catastrophic. If this truth leaked to the trenches, if a 19-year-old conscript realized that his sacrifice was rewarded with betrayal, what then? What soldier would storm into machine gun fire for a homeland that had already cuckolded him in absentia? The Nazis had demanded everything from their men: youth, freedom, blood, and life itself. In return, they could not guarantee the one thing those men fought for: fidelity. The state had asked for devotion in exchange for illusion. Himmler, when the final report was laid on his desk, reportedly raged, but his fury was not directed at the women. It was directed at the paper itself. The truth was not the problem. The report was the problem. The solution was simple: bury it, silence it, make it vanish. And so, stamped Geheim Reichsesche, secret Reich matter, the Spengler report was locked in the deepest vaults of the SS archives, sealed away for the eyes of only the highest echelon. This act of burial is one of the most overlooked but significant acts of the Second World War. It was not about guns or tanks. It was about ideology colliding with reality. And when the two clashed, reality was declared too dangerous to exist. But why should you care about a classified report from 80 years ago? Because the burial of the Spengler report is the ultimate black pill of history. It is a case study in a universal principle. Those in power will always seek to control the narrative. And the most dangerous narrative to any power structure is the truth about loyalty, especially women's loyalty to men. For all its evil, the Nazi state was fundamentally gynocentric in its demands on men. It demanded male disposability. Men were the currency. Men were to die for the glory of the Reich. And in return, the state promised that their women would remain faithful, their families secure. The Spengler report revealed that this promise was a lie. The system was willing to ask men to die for an illusion. And here is the uncomfortable part. This pattern did not end in 1945. It did not die in the rubble of Berlin. It simply evolved. The modern world makes the same implicit contract with men. Work yourself into an early grave at a job you despise. Take on debts that chain you for life. Shoulder all the risk. Be the provider, the protector, the disposable cog. And the reward, the promise of stability, respect, the faithful partner who will stand by you. But just as in 1943, that loyalty is conditional. It is contingent upon performance, your status, your ability to provide advantage. Lose your job, show weakness, fall behind, and watch how quickly the promise dissolves. The Dear John letters of wartime Germany have become today's divorce papers, but the mechanism is unchanged. The underlying principle is the same. Loyalty is transactional, not absolute. The Spengler report is not just a historical document. It is a mirror. It stares back at you with a truth as relevant now as it was then. Your worth, in the eyes of both the system and often the women conditioned by it, is tethered to what you can provide. To deny this is to live in delusion. To accept it is not to grow bitter, but to grow free. For the first step toward liberation is to stop living for external validation and to cultivate an inner core of worth that no betrayal, no market crash, no broken contract can strip from you. But the story does not end with a locked cabinet in Berlin, because truth has a way of leaking through cracks, of resurfacing when you least expect it. The real tragedy is what happened after the war. The men who returned in 1945, those who limped out of POW camps, who trudged back from the Eastern Front, who staggered into cities reduced to ash, did not just find their homeland destroyed. They found their lives stolen, their wives gone, their children calling another man father. The silence that fell over Germany after 1945 was not only the silence of defeat, it was the silence of millions of men who had been psychologically castrated, first by a state that demanded everything and lied to them in return, then by a peace that offered no justice, only humiliation. These men became the walking shadows of post-war Europe, broken, forgotten, erased. And here lies the cruel irony. The allies who defeated the Reich, the liberators who promised a new world, inadvertently perpetuated the very same cycle of male disposability. Men rebuilt cities, cleared rubble, labored until they dropped. Once again, they were the sacrificial foundation of a world that offered them little in return. The burial of the Spengler report was only the beginning. The real tragedy was what happened when the truth was left underground, when silence became the only answer, when generations of men inherited not knowledge but confusion. The silence of the grave, the silence that settled over Europe in May of 1945, was not peace. It was the silence of ruins, a choking stillness filled with ash, hunger, and truths no one dared to voice. For millions of German men walking back into what was left of their homeland, the war had not ended. It had only changed shape. The weapons were gone, the gunfire was silent, but now began a different battle. One fought not on muddy fields or city streets, but inside the human spirit. These were not just soldiers. They were boys who had grown into broken old men at the age of 20. Survivors of Stalingrad who had witnessed entire divisions ground into bone and dust. Prisoners who had labored for years in Soviet camps, starved to skeletons, beaten until their souls nearly gave out. For them, the promise had always been the same, that they were fighting for a Germany worth returning to. A homeland, a family, a love waiting at the end of the road. But buried deep in the rubble of SS headquarters lay the Spengler Report, a cold prophecy that foresaw their real fate. It warned that the front line they would one day face would not be Russia, nor France, nor Britain. It would be their very own doorsteps. Picture one of them. His name is Eric, 24 years old, though his hollow cheeks and gray eyes belong to a man twice his age. His uniform is ragged, hanging off his wasted frame. His body is racked with disease, his mind crowded with the ghosts of friends blown apart in frozen fields. For 3 years in a Siberian labor camp, the only thing that kept him alive was not bread, nor hope of freedom, but the memory of his wife, Greta. Her smile, the sound of her laughter, the warmth of her hand in his. These were his relics, sacred fragments of a world worth surviving for. After months of trudging across broken roads and hitching rides on carts, Eric finally reaches his city, or what is left of it. The skyline is jagged, buildings torn open like carcasses, whole streets reduced to blackened stone. And yet his building still stands. His heart beats with terror more than joy as he climbs the stairs. He knocks. The door opens. Greta stands before him, older, harder. Her eyes are cautious, almost afraid. Clinging to her skirts is a small child, a girl, barely 2 years old, who stares wide-eyed at the skeletal stranger calling himself her father. And then from inside the apartment, a man's voice rings out. "Greta, who is it?" In that instant, Eric's world collapses. Everything he had fought for, starved for, survived for, gone. He is not a hero returning home. He is a ghost, an intruder, a reminder no one wants. This story, told in countless variations, was not just Eric's. It was the story of an entire generation. A silent domestic apocalypse unfolding across Germany. While the men were gone, a new order had risen, built not by them, but by the women left behind. The Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, would later be celebrated as symbols of German strength, women clearing mountains of bricks with their bare hands, reconstructing cities from dust. And yes, many did. Their labor was real, their resilience undeniable. But the bright image painted in post-war propaganda masked a darker reality. For every woman bending her back out of civic duty, there was another who had learned to survive by far colder means. The rubble to be cleared was not only physical. It was the rubble of family bonds, of broken vows, of identities shattered beyond repair. The betrayal was swift and merciless. Many men came home to discover their wives had already filed for divorce, often on the grounds of abandonment. A cruel twist of law that turned the state-ordered duty of war into a personal failing. Courts eager to prove their denazification credentials sided with women. The returning soldier was not greeted with open arms but with eviction notices. Their homes gone, their bank accounts emptied, their children taught to call them uncle so as not to disrupt the new household order. This phenomenon became so widespread it earned a bitter name, Uncle Eric Syndrome. And here, the deepest irony of history revealed itself. The Allies, who had fought to annihilate Nazi doctrines of racial superiority, became the living proof of the Spengler Report's prediction that female loyalty would shift toward men who offered security and status. And in 1945, there was no greater symbol of power and stability than the occupying Allied soldier. The American GI with his cigarettes, his chocolate, his nylon stockings, and tins of meat was no mere man in the eyes of starving, desperate women. He was abundance incarnate, a walking ticket to survival. For a German woman facing hunger and ruin, his embrace meant safety. For her returning husband, gaunt and broken, it meant erasure. The word Fräulein Wonder, girl wonder, was coined with a mocking laugh, describing the eager relationships between German women and Allied soldiers. But for the men, there was no laughter. To them, it was humiliation carved deep into their bones. They had lost the war on the battlefield. Now they were losing their wives, their homes, even their children to the very men who had conquered them. The Spengler report's cold conclusion that loyalty follows resources was not a theory anymore. It was reality, played out not in statistics or charts but in living rooms, kitchens, and beds across Germany. The victors had claimed not only land and treasure, they had claimed the intimate heart of the defeated. And so, the final battle was not fought with rifles. It was fought with glances, with betrayals, with silences across dinner tables. It was fought in courtrooms where broken men begged for scraps of dignity. It was fought in the small moments when a child reached for another man's hand instead of their father's. For the German soldier who returned home, the war was never over. It had only changed uniforms. It is almost impossible to measure the depth of this wound. A trauma without a name, without recognition, and without release. These men could not speak of it. To voice their grief was to be branded a sore loser, a bitter Nazi, or a man unwilling to face the consequences of a war his nation had unleashed. Their anguish was judged illegitimate. Their silence was enforced not by chains, but by shame. They were commanded to swallow their pride, bury their sorrow, and devote themselves to rebuilding a country that, in their eyes, had betrayed them twice. First, by sending them to fight in a hopeless war. Second, by discarding them like broken tools when they returned. What grew out of this betrayal was a generation of hollowed men. They became the stone-faced fathers and grandfathers of what would later be called the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. Outwardly, they built factories, cities, and wealth. Inwardly, they remained trapped in the frozen wasteland of Stalingrad, their emotions sealed behind walls of ice. They did not cry. They did not speak. They labored, silently pouring all their unexpressed grief into the foundations of a new Germany. The male spirit had not been shattered by enemy fire. It was dismantled slowly, in the quiet treachery of the homecoming. This silence carried forward like an inheritance. Their sons grew up in houses where fathers were present in body but absent in soul. A father at the dinner table but never truly there. A man quick to anger, incapable of tenderness, incapable even of numbing what was wrong inside him. These sons inherited not guidance but confusion, not strength but suspicion. They learned that masculinity was something unspoken, a puzzle with missing pieces. And the missing pieces were carved away by the unhealed wounds of the war. Thus, a chain of male trauma was forged link by link. From the state that demanded everything, to the women whose loyalty proved conditional, to the sons who were raised without a map for their own manhood. This chain was the true poison of the buried Spengler report. Because the report was suppressed, the wound was never cleaned. It festered in silence, passing its infection from one generation to the next. This is why the story of the Spengler report is not some relic of Nazi Germany. It is not simply an artifact of a monstrous ideology. It is a case study of the male condition itself. The uniforms and flags have changed, but the pattern remains. Look at the modern world. The system makes the same contract with men today that the Reich once did, though now in softer, subtler tones. You may not be asked to die in the mud, but you are asked to die in smaller ways day by day. Sacrifice your health to the job. Sacrifice your youth to the ladder of success. Sacrifice your spirit to the expectation of being the provider, the protector, the unshakable rock. And what is the promised reward? A family, a loyal partner, respect, belonging. But just as in 1945, this promise is built on sand. Because when a man falters, when he loses his job, when depression claims him, when illness strips him of strength, the machinery of disposability awakens. Divorce papers, custody battles, abandonment masked as empowerment. The Dear John letter is now a text message. The wartime replacement is now the charming colleague, the high-status executive, the man who steps into your absence without hesitation. The form is modern, but the principle is ancient. Loyalty flows not to sacrifice, but to resources. To understand this truth is not to hate women. It is to finally see the game for what it is. The black pill, as some now call it, is not about bitterness. It is about clarity. The Spengler report is the blackest pill of all because it strips away the illusion. It shows that the romantic ideal sold to men is not only fragile, it is weaponized against them. The liberation begins when a man stops playing by rules designed for him to lose. When he understands that his worth cannot depend on his utility to a state, or to a woman who may see him as replaceable. The true path is not in begging for validation. It is in building an inner fortress, a life whose purpose is self-authored, not state-assigned, a strength that cannot be stolen by betrayal or by circumstance. The men who lived through the silent betrayal of the post-war years learned this too late. They survived not through recognition or justice, but through a grim kind of resilience. They found solace in their labor, in small brotherhoods of other wounded men, in stoic acceptance of a reality they could not change. Their victory was quiet, uncelebrated, invisible. But your victory does not have to be. You stand with hindsight. You have the key they were denied. The Spengler report, long buried, is not only a relic of pain, it is a mirror. It shows you that your anger, your confusion, your sense of disposability is not madness. It is not weakness. It is the rational response of a man awakening to the nature of the system around him. And so your duty is different, not to rebuild a nation that does not value you, but to rebuild yourself, to forge a mission that cannot be stolen, to cultivate a strength that is yours alone, to write a story where you are no longer a pawn. The darkest truth buried in 1945 was not about women, nor even about war. It was about the system's willingness to sacrifice the masculine soul without hesitation. Knowing this is your armor. Living in defiance of it is your victory. The report was buried to keep men blind. Now that you see, the silence is broken.